Mr. Wilson never raised his voice, never sent kids to the principal, just quietly taught history while the class ignored him. The regular teacher said he was harmless enough for a few weeks, until the day Marcus started a fight in the back row and something shifted in the substitute's eyes. When Wilson moved to break it up, every motion was precise, controlled, lethal. That's when they realized their boring old teacher moved like someone who'd learned violence in places they couldn't imagine. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden strength, quiet authority, and the moment when a classroom full of teenagers learned what real respect looks like, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like Mr. Wilson's deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the teachers who carry more than just lesson plans. Jefferson High School had seen its share of substitute teachers over the years. Most lasted a day, maybe a week before the students wore them down with noise, disrespect, and the casual cruelty that teenagers could inflict without thinking twice. The regular faculty had learned to lower their expectations when they had to call in a sub, just keep the kids in their seats and try to prevent complete chaos. Robert Wilson was different, though nobody could quite put their finger on why. He'd been covering Mrs. Patterson's American history classes for 3 weeks while she recovered from surgery, and he hadn't quit yet. He was maybe 65, with gray hair that was always neatly combed, wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like someone's grandfather, and the kind of patient demeanor that suggested he'd dealt with difficult situations before. Wilson wore the same thing every day: pressed khakis, a button-down shirt rolled to the forearms, and comfortable walking shoes that squeaked slightly on the linoleum. He carried his materials in a worn leather briefcase that looked older than most of his students, and he always arrived 20 minutes early to write the day's lesson on the whiteboard in precise, careful handwriting. The students at Jefferson High had Mr. Wilson figured out within the first week. He was soft, harmless, the kind of substitute who wouldn't cause trouble if they didn't cause too much trouble for him. He never raised his voice when they talked during his lectures. He never sent anyone to the office when they used their phones. He just continued teaching as if they were paying attention, occasionally pausing to look over his glasses at particularly disruptive students with an expression that was more disappointed than angry. Easy target was how Marcus Thompson described him to his friends. Marcus was 17, 6'2", and had the kind of swagger that came from being the star of the basketball team and knowing that most teachers would cut him slack because of it. He'd tested Wilson's boundaries every day, talking loudly during lessons, refusing to participate in discussions, making jokes that got the other students laughing. Wilson's response was always the same: a brief pause, a look over his glasses, and then a return to the lesson. No confrontation, no consequences, no drama. "Dude's scared of us," Marcus would say. Probably never had to deal with real students before, but some of the quieter students had noticed things about Mr. Wilson that didn't quite fit the image of a pushover substitute. Sarah Chen, who sat in the front row because she actually wanted to learn, had observed that Wilson never seemed startled by sudden noises, not when someone dropped a book, not when the construction crew outside started using jackhammers, not even when the fire alarm had malfunctioned during second period. She'd also noticed that Wilson knew a lot more about military history than any substitute teacher should. When they covered World War II, he didn't just read from the textbook. He explained tactics, described equipment in detail, talked about the psychology of combat in ways that made Sarah think he'd studied the subject extensively. And there was something about the way Wilson carried himself that reminded Sarah of her uncle, who'd been a Marine. A kind of awareness, like he was always conscious of everyone in the room and everything that was happening around him. But Sarah was a quiet student who kept her observations to herself, and the rest of the class was too busy testing Wilson's patience to notice the subtleties. Tommy Rodriguez was one of the students who enjoyed pushing boundaries, not as aggressively as Marcus, but Tommy liked to see how far he could go before a teacher snapped. He'd throw wadded paper when Wilson's back was turned, make sarcastic comments during discussions, engage in whispered conversations that were just loud enough to be disruptive. Wilson's response was always measured, controlled. "Mr. Rodriguez, do you have something you'd like to share with the class?" He'd ask in the same calm tone he used for everything else. When Tommy inevitably said no, Wilson would simply nod and continue with the lesson. It was almost disappointing how unflappable the old man was. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in October during Wilson's 4th week at Jefferson High. The lesson was supposed to be about the Vietnam War, but Marcus had arrived in a particularly bad mood after a fight with his girlfriend, and he was looking for someone to take it out on. Wilson had just started explaining the political context of American involvement in Southeast Asia when Marcus interrupted. "This is boring," Marcus announced loudly. "Why do we have to learn about some ancient war that doesn't matter anymore?" Wilson paused, looked over his glasses, and responded in his usual calm manner. "History helps us understand how we got to where we are today, Mr. Thompson. The decisions made during the Vietnam era still influence." "Still influence what?" Marcus cut him off. "My grandfather fought in that war and all it did was mess him up. You probably never even left your classroom, so what do you know about it?" A few students shifted uncomfortably. Marcus was crossing a line, but Wilson didn't seem bothered. He just nodded thoughtfully. "You're right that war affects people in profound ways," Wilson said. "Perhaps we could discuss, maybe we should talk about something that actually matters," Marcus interrupted again, emboldened by Wilson's apparent passivity. "Like why they stick us with substitute teachers who don't know anything about real life." The classroom was getting restless now. Some students were laughing at Marcus's comments, others were checking their phones, and a few were having their own side conversations. Wilson had lost control of the room, and everyone knew it. That's when Marcus decided to escalate. "Hey, Tommy," Marcus called across the room, his voice deliberately loud. "You want to hear something funny? My cousin says this old man has been teaching the same lessons for like 20 years, probably never even had a real job." Tommy, caught up in the momentum of Marcus's rebellion, grinned and played along. "Yeah? What else did your cousin say?" Marcus stood up from his desk, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "He said Wilson here probably couldn't handle one day in the real world. Soft old man who hides in classrooms because he's too scared to do anything else." Wilson had stopped writing on the whiteboard. He was standing perfectly still, his back still turned to the class, but something in his posture had changed. "Sit down, Mr. Thompson," Wilson said quietly, not turning around. Marcus laughed. "Or what? You'll give me detention? Send me to the principal?" He took a step toward the front of the room. "You know what I think? I think you're afraid of us. I think you don't do anything because you can't do anything." The classroom had gone quiet, except for Marcus's voice. Even the students who usually ignored everything were paying attention now, sensing that something was about to happen. Wilson slowly turned around to face the class. His expression was calm, but there was something different in his eyes, something that made Sarah Chen sit up straighter in her chair. "Mr. Thompson," Wilson said in the same quiet tone he always used, "I'm going to ask you one more time to sit down." Marcus took another step forward, his 17-year-old bravado overriding any instinct for caution. "And I'm telling you, I don't have to do anything you say. You're just a substitute. You don't have any real authority here." That's when Tommy Rodriguez made a mistake that would change everything. Emboldened by Marcus's defiance and eager to impress his friends, Tommy stood up and moved toward Marcus, apparently intending to join in the confrontation with Wilson. But as he passed by Sarah Chen's desk, Tommy accidentally knocked her textbook to the floor with enough force that it slammed loudly against the tiles. Sarah bent to pick up her book, and Tommy, showing off for the class, gave her shoulder a hard shove that sent her stumbling into her desk. "Oops," Tommy said with exaggerated innocence. "Clumsy." What happened next occurred so fast that most students would later disagree about the exact sequence of events. Wilson moved. Not the slow, careful movement of a 65-year-old teacher, but the lightning-quick response of someone whose body remembered different training. He crossed the room in 3 strides, each step perfectly placed, perfectly balanced. Tommy was still smirking about his joke when Wilson's hand closed around his wrist. Not roughly, not violently, but with an iron grip that immediately communicated absolute control. "You will apologize to Ms. Chen," Wilson said in the same quiet voice he'd used for everything else, but now that voice carried an authority that made every student in the room freeze. Tommy tried to pull his wrist free and discovered he couldn't. Wilson's grip was immovable, and when Tommy looked into the substitute teacher's eyes, he saw something that made his smart remarks die in his throat. I was just," Tommy stammered. Wilson adjusted his grip slightly, and Tommy winced. The teacher hadn't hurt him, but the message was clear. He could. "You will apologize to Ms. Chen," Wilson repeated in exactly the same tone. Tommy looked around the room for support, but every student was staring at Wilson with expressions of shock and growing understanding. Marcus had stopped his advance toward the front of the room and was standing frozen halfway down the aisle. "Sorry, Sarah," Tommy mumbled. Wilson's grip didn't loosen. "Look at her when you apologize, and mean it." Tommy turned to face Sarah, who was clutching her retrieved textbook and watching the scene with wide eyes. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I shouldn't have pushed you." Wilson held Tommy's gaze for another moment, then slowly released his wrist. Tommy immediately stepped back, rubbing the spot where Wilson's fingers had been. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. The substitute teacher then turned his attention to Marcus, who was still standing in the middle of the classroom, looking uncertain for the first time since Wilson had started teaching there. "Mr. Thompson," Wilson said, and now his voice carried a quality that made Marcus instinctively straighten his shoulders. "You have something to say?" Marcus looked around the room, searching for support that was no longer there. His classmates were watching him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to anticipation, but none of them were encouraging his rebellion anymore. "No, sir," Marcus said, the "sir" slipping out automatically. "Then I suggest you take your seat." Marcus moved immediately, his feet carrying him back to his desk without conscious thought. Something in Wilson's tone had triggered an obedience response that overrode his teenage defiance. The classroom was completely silent now. 28 students sitting perfectly still, all of them staring at their substitute teacher with new understanding. Wilson returned to the front of the room with the same measured steps he always used, but now those steps seemed deliberate in a different way. He picked up his marker and turned back to the whiteboard. "Now," he said in his normal teaching voice as if nothing had happened, "let's continue our discussion of Vietnam. Can anyone tell me what the Tet Offensive was?" Sarah Chen's hand went up immediately. "Yes, Ms. Chen. It was a coordinated attack by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces on major cities and military installations throughout South Vietnam in 1968, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tension still filling the room. "Excellent," Wilson replied, writing key points on the board. "And what was the strategic significance of this offensive?" For the remaining 30 minutes of class, Wilson taught with the same calm demeanor he had always had, but now every student was paying attention. They took notes, they asked questions, they participated in discussions. No one used their phone, no one threw paper, no one whispered to their neighbors. And when the bell rang, they filed out quietly, many of them glancing back at Wilson with expressions of curiosity and something that might have been respect. But the day wasn't over yet. During lunch, word spread quickly through Jefferson High about what had happened in Wilson's American history class. The story grew with each telling. Tommy had been grabbed, Marcus had been intimidated, the substitute teacher had shown a side of himself that no one had expected. By the time the story reached Coach Martinez in the faculty lounge, it had evolved into something that made him very interested in having a conversation with Mr. Wilson. Coach Martinez had been teaching and coaching at Jefferson High for 15 years. He was a former Army sergeant who'd done 2 tours in Iraq before becoming an educator, and he'd developed a reputation for being able to handle the most difficult students because he understood authority and respect in ways that most civilian teachers didn't. He'd been watching Wilson for weeks, noticing small things that reminded him of other veterans he'd known. The way Wilson carried himself, the way he was always aware of his surroundings, the calm way he dealt with disruption. During the lunch break, Coach Martinez walked down to Mrs. Patterson's classroom, where Wilson was eating a sandwich and reviewing lesson plans for his afternoon classes. "Mind if I join you?" Coach Martinez asked. Wilson looked up and nodded toward the empty chair across from his desk. "Of course." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Coach Martinez spoke. "Heard you had an interesting morning." Wilson continued chewing his sandwich thoughtfully. "Students testing boundaries, normal teenage behavior. Heard you handled it pretty effectively. The situation required clear communication." Coach Martinez smiled. There was something about Wilson's phrasing, his choice of words, that confirmed his suspicions. "You military?" Coach Martinez asked directly. Wilson paused with his sandwich halfway to his mouth. "Why do you ask?" "Because I am. Army. 2 tours in Iraq, and you move like someone who's been trained." Wilson set down his sandwich and studied Coach Martinez's face. "What gave it away?" "Lots of little things, but mostly the way you handled that situation this morning. Controlled force, clear commands, immediate establishment of authority. That's not teaching training. That's combat training." Wilson was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he nodded slightly. "Marines. 3 tours. Vietnam." Coach Martinez felt a chill of respect run down his spine. Vietnam veterans were becoming rarer every year, and the ones who'd served in combat were a special breed of men who'd faced things most people couldn't imagine. "How long?" Coach Martinez asked. 67 to 70. 1st Marine Division, then Force Recon. Force Recon. Coach Martinez knew enough military history to understand what that meant. Marine Force Reconnaissance was an elite unit that conducted deep penetration missions behind enemy lines. These weren't regular infantry. They were specially trained operators who worked in small teams in hostile territory. "Jesus," Coach Martinez said quietly. "And you've been teaching?" 23 years in education after I got out, regular classroom teacher until I retired. Started substituting because—" Wilson shrugged. "Seemed like a good way to stay useful." "Why didn't you mention your background when you started here?" Wilson picked up his sandwich again. "Because it's not relevant to teaching American history. These kids don't need to know about my past. They need to learn about their country's past." Coach Martinez understood. Many veterans preferred to keep their service private, especially those who'd seen heavy combat. They'd learned to compartmentalize, to separate their military identity from their civilian life. "But it is relevant," Coach Martinez said. "What you bring to the classroom, the way you handle pressure, the way you project authority, the way you can command respect when you need to." "I don't want to command anything," Wilson replied. "I just want to teach." "But you can when you have to, like this morning." Wilson was quiet for a moment. Tommy Rodriguez was out of line. Someone needed to address it. "And Marcus Thompson?" "Marcus is testing boundaries because no one's given him any worth respecting. He's not a bad kid. He's just never learned what real authority looks like." Coach Martinez nodded. He'd seen the same thing in many students, especially the ones who came from homes where authority was either absent or abusive. They pushed against every boundary until they found one that held firm. "You know, the kids are talking about you differently now," Coach Martinez said. Wilson sighed. "I was afraid of that." "Why? It's a good thing. They respect you now." "Respect should come from competence and consistency, not from intimidation." "You didn't intimidate anyone. You established clear expectations and enforced them fairly. That's not intimidation. That's leadership." Wilson finished his sandwich and began packing up his materials for the afternoon. Leadership is about serving others, not controlling them. And sometimes serving others means showing them what discipline looks like. As Wilson prepared to leave for his next class, Coach Martinez made a decision. "Would you be interested in guest lecturing for my ROTC program? We could use someone with your background to talk about military history from a first-hand perspective." Wilson paused with his briefcase half closed. "I don't talk about the war. I'm not asking you to share war stories. I'm asking you to share knowledge. These kids want to serve their country. They could benefit from hearing from someone who's already done it." Wilson considered this for a moment. "What would you want me to cover?" "Leadership principles, the importance of discipline, what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. For the first time since Coach Martinez had entered the classroom, Wilson smiled slightly. Let me think about it. That afternoon, Wilson's fifth period class was markedly different from his morning sessions. Word had spread throughout the school about the incident with Tommy and Marcus, and students who'd spent weeks ignoring their substitute teacher were now paying careful attention. But it wasn't fear that kept them focused. It was curiosity. Marcus Thompson arrived early and took his seat without his usual swagger. When Wilson entered the classroom, Marcus made eye contact and nodded respectfully. "Good afternoon, class," Wilson said in his normal tone. "Today we're going to continue our study of the Vietnam War by examining the social and political impact on American society." Sarah Chen raised her hand immediately. "Mr. Wilson, could you explain why the war was so controversial here at home?" Wilson began his explanation with the same measured approach he always used, but now the entire class was listening. They asked follow-up questions. They wanted to understand not just the facts, but the context, the human cost, the long-term consequences. Halfway through the lesson, Marcus raised his hand. "Yes, Mr. Thompson?" "Sir, my grandfather served in Vietnam, but he never talked about it. My family always said it was because the war was unpopular and people treated veterans badly when they came home." Wilson paused his writing on the whiteboard. "That's correct. Many Vietnam veterans faced hostility from anti-war protesters who conflated opposition to the war with opposition to the warriors. It was a difficult time for men who'd served their country." "Is that why veterans don't like to talk about it?" Wilson turned to face the class. "There are many reasons why veterans might choose not to discuss their service. Sometimes it's because of painful memories. Sometimes it's because civilian audiences can't relate to military experiences. And sometimes it's because they believe their service speaks for itself without needing explanation." Tommy Rodriguez, who'd been silent since the morning incident, raised his hand tentatively. "Mr. Wilson, my grandmother always said her brother changed after he came back from Vietnam, like he was the same person but different at the same time. Is that normal?" Wilson set down his marker and gave Tommy his full attention. "War changes people, Mr. Rodriguez. It has to. You can't experience the kinds of stress and responsibility that come with military service, especially combat service, without it affecting how you see the world." "But is that bad?" Sarah asked. "I mean, does it damage people?" "It changes people," Wilson repeated. "Whether that change is damage or growth depends on many factors: the individual, their support system, how they process their experiences, and how society receives them when they return." The questions continued for the rest of the period, and Wilson found himself sharing more about the psychological and social aspects of military service than he'd intended. Not personal stories, but insights into the veteran experience that could only come from someone who'd lived it. When the bell rang, the students didn't immediately rush for the door. Several approached Wilson's desk with additional questions, and he answered each one thoughtfully. Marcus was the last to leave. "Mr. Wilson," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology for this morning. I was disrespectful, and there's no excuse for that." Wilson looked at the young man, really looked at him, and saw something he recognized. Marcus had the build and bearing of someone who could be a good soldier if he learned discipline and found the right motivation. "Apology accepted, Mr. Thompson. But more importantly, I hope you learned something from the experience." "Yes, sir, I did." Marcus hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Were you really a Marine?" Wilson considered his answer carefully. The secret was already out. Coach Martinez knew, and word would spread among the faculty. There was no point in denying it. "Yes, I was." Marcus nodded as if that explained everything. "That's why you move different. My uncle was Army, and he moves like you do, like he's always ready for something." "Awareness is a habit that's hard to break," Wilson said. "Is it a good habit?" Wilson smiled slightly. "In my experience, yes." That evening, Wilson got a call from Principal Williams. Bob, I heard about what happened in your class today. Are you all right? I'm fine, Janet. Just a typical classroom management situation. Coach Martinez says you handled it very professionally. He also mentioned that you have a military background. Wilson sighed. Yes, I do. Why didn't you mention that on your application? Because it wasn't relevant to the position. Principal Williams was quiet for a moment. Bob, we've had Tommy Rodriguez in the office a dozen times this semester for disruptive behavior. Same with Marcus Thompson. But both of them spent their afternoon classes telling other teachers how much they learned in your class today. They're good kids. They just needed clear expectations. Maybe. But I think there's more to it than that. Principal Williams paused. Bob, I know Mrs. Patterson is planning to return next week, but I'd like to talk to you about the possibility of staying on longer. We have a position opening up in our social studies department. Wilson was surprised. You're offering me a full-time position. I'm asking if you'd consider it. You've accomplished something in 3 weeks that some teachers struggle with all year. You've earned real respect from students who don't respect much of anything. Wilson looked around his apartment, the neat, quiet space where he'd been living a peaceful retirement, a place where no one asked him about Vietnam, where no one expected him to be anything other than a polite neighbor who kept to himself. I'll need to think about it, he said. Of course. Take your time. After hanging up, Wilson sat in his favorite chair and thought about the day, about Tommy's question and Marcus's apology, about Sarah's genuine interest in learning and Coach Martinez's invitation to speak to ROTC students. He thought about the moment when he'd grabbed Tommy's wrist and seen the recognition in the boy's eyes, not fear, but understanding that he was dealing with someone who commanded respect for good reasons. For 23 years, Wilson had taught in classrooms where his military background was known and respected. Students understood that their teacher had served his country and that service added weight to his words about duty, sacrifice, and the importance of education. But for the past few years of retirement, he'd been anonymous, just another substitute teacher, easily ignored and quickly forgotten. Today had reminded him that his service wasn't just history. It was part of who he was, and it had value in shaping the next generation. The next morning, Wilson arrived at Jefferson High to find Coach Martinez waiting by his classroom door. Thought about my offer? Coach Martinez asked. Yes, I have. And? What would you want me to tell your ROTC students? Coach Martinez smiled. That service means something. That discipline isn't punishment, it's preparation. That respect is earned through competence and character. Wilson unlocked his classroom door and invited Coach Martinez inside. When would you want me to speak? How about next week? We're covering military history and it would be perfect timing. No war stories, Wilson said firmly. Understood. Just principles. They were interrupted by a knock on the door frame. Marcus Thompson and Tommy Rodriguez were standing in the hallway, both looking somewhat uncertain. Mr. Wilson, Marcus said, could we talk to you for a minute? Of course. Come in. The boys entered the classroom, and Wilson could see that they'd rehearsed whatever they wanted to say. Tommy spoke first. We wanted to thank you for yesterday, not just for, the correction, but for treating us like we could handle a real conversation about important stuff. Marcus nodded. Most teachers just talk at us like we're idiots. But you actually answered our questions and explained things like you thought we could understand them. Wilson set down his briefcase and gave the boys his full attention. You can understand them. You're more capable than most people give you credit for. Is it true that you were a Marine? Marcus asked. Wilson glanced at Coach Martinez, who nodded encouragingly. Yes, it's true. Were you in combat? Wilson considered his answer carefully. Yes, I was. Tommy and Marcus exchanged glances. What was it like? Tommy asked quietly. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, Wilson said honestly, and it taught me lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. What kind of lessons? Wilson sat on the edge of his desk, a gesture that brought him closer to the boy's eye level. That you're capable of more than you think you are when people are counting on you. That discipline isn't about following rules. It's about being reliable when it matters. That respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn by serving something bigger than yourself. Marcus absorbed this. Is that why you became a teacher? I became a teacher because I believe education is another form of service. Instead of protecting people with weapons, I protect their future with knowledge. The boys were quiet for a moment, processing this. Mr. Wilson, Tommy said finally, are you going to keep teaching here? Wilson looked at the boys, then at Coach Martinez, then around the classroom where he'd spent the past few weeks rediscovering something he'd thought he'd left behind. Yes, he said. I think I am. That afternoon, Wilson called Principal Williams. Janet, about that position we discussed. Yes? I'd like to accept it. Wonderful. What changed your mind? Wilson looked out his classroom window at students walking across the campus, backpacks slung over their shoulders, talking and laughing and planning their futures. I remembered why I became a teacher in the first place. 6 months later, Wilson's classroom had become one of the most requested courses at Jefferson High. Students who'd never shown interest in history were signing up for his classes, drawn by his reputation for treating them with respect while maintaining high standards. The walls were decorated with maps and timelines, but also with something new, a display case containing medals and commendations that Wilson had finally agreed to share. Not to boast about his service, but to illustrate the values he tried to teach: courage, honor, commitment, and sacrifice. Marcus Thompson had become one of Wilson's most engaged students. His grades had improved dramatically, and he'd started talking about military service after graduation. Wilson had introduced him to Coach Martinez's ROTC program, where Marcus was learning about leadership and discipline in ways that channeled his natural assertiveness into positive directions. Tommy Rodriguez had discovered a genuine interest in military history and was considering applying to the Naval Academy. Wilson helped him with his application essay, offering guidance about what military service really meant and why it mattered. Sarah Chen had started a school newspaper and had interviewed Wilson about his experiences as both a Marine and a teacher. The article, titled From Battlefield to Blackboard, had won a state journalism award and helped other students understand the connection between military service and civilian leadership. Wilson's guest lectures for the ROTC program had evolved into a regular monthly series where he discussed leadership principles, military history, and the importance of service. He never shared war stories, but he did share the lessons he'd learned about courage, discipline, and the responsibility that comes with strength. The most significant change, however, was in Wilson himself. For years after retiring from education, he'd felt somewhat adrift. Substitute teaching had been a way to stay busy, but it hadn't felt meaningful. He'd been going through the motions of teaching without the deeper sense of purpose that had originally drawn him to education. The incident with Marcus and Tommy had reminded him that teaching wasn't just about conveying information. It was about shaping character, inspiring growth, and helping young people understand their potential. One afternoon, as Wilson was preparing to leave for the day, Principal Williams stopped by his classroom. "Bob, I wanted to thank you for staying. You've made a real difference here." Wilson looked around his classroom, at the engaged student work on the bulletin boards, the thank you notes from parents, the photos from his ROTC presentations. "This place has made a difference for me too." "How so?" Wilson thought about how to explain it. "For a long time after I retired, I felt like my useful days were behind me, like the most important things I'd ever done were in the past. And now I understand that experience isn't valuable because it's in the past. It's valuable because it prepares you for the future." Principal Williams nodded. "The students certainly see that value." Wilson smiled. "They also help me see it." As Wilson walked to his car that evening, he passed a group of his students gathered around picnic tables in the courtyard. Marcus was explaining something about military strategy to Tommy and Sarah, using gestures and diagrams that Wilson recognized from his own teaching. The boys saw him and waved. "Mr. Wilson," Marcus called, "settle an argument for us. Tommy thinks the Marines and the Army basically do the same job, but I told him you guys are different. Wilson walked over to the group. How are we different, Mr. Thompson? Marcus straightened slightly. Marines are expeditionary forces. First to fight, first in, last out. Army does occupation and longer-term operations. Very good. And what does that teach us about the importance of having different tools for different jobs? Sarah raised her hand as if she were in class. That diversity of approach makes an organization stronger? Exactly. Whether we're talking about military branches or classroom learning styles, or any other situation where people need to work together. Wilson had learned that every interaction was a teaching opportunity, and these students had learned that every question could become a deeper lesson about life, service, and character. As he continued toward his car, Wilson reflected on the journey that had brought him from a quiet retirement to this renewed sense of purpose. Sometimes the most important chapters of your life begin when you think the story is ending. Sometimes the skills you thought you'd left behind are exactly what the next generation needs to learn. And sometimes a substitute teacher discovers that he's not really substituting at all. He's exactly where he's supposed to be, doing exactly what he's meant to do. Wilson had spent 3 tours in Vietnam learning about service, sacrifice, and leadership under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Then, he'd spent 23 years in the classroom learning how to pass those lessons on to young people who would shape the future. Now, in what he'd thought would be the quiet twilight of his career, he'd discovered that the most important teaching moments often come when students need more than just information. They need examples of what it means to live with honor, courage, and purpose. His military service had prepared him to protect and serve in combat. His teaching career had prepared him to protect and serve through education, and his time at Jefferson High had reminded him that both forms of service were part of the same mission, preparing the next generation to be better than the one before. Robert Wilson never intended to be anything more than a quiet substitute teacher, filling in temporarily while the regular instructor recovered. He'd served his country with distinction, taught for over 2 decades, and earned a peaceful retirement. But sometimes life asks us to serve again in ways we never expected. Wilson's story reminds us that the qualities that make someone an effective warrior, discipline, courage, the ability to stay calm under pressure, and the willingness to put others before yourself, are the same qualities that make someone an effective teacher, parent, mentor, and leader. The classroom became Wilson's final battlefield, where he fought not against an enemy, but against ignorance, disrespect, and the dangerous idea that young people can't handle high expectations or meaningful challenges. His weapon wasn't a rifle, but respect, earned through competence, maintained through consistency, and deployed through quiet authority that never needed to raise its voice to be heard. Wilson's students learned that real strength doesn't announce itself. It simply shows up when needed, does what must be done, and returns to quiet service without seeking recognition or praise. They learned that discipline isn't punishment. It's preparation for moments when you need to be your best self for the sake of others. And they learned that the most powerful teaching doesn't come from textbooks or lectures, but from the example of someone who has lived the values they're trying to pass on. Wilson's transformation from overlooked substitute to respected educator wasn't accomplished through force or intimidation. It happened because he demonstrated what it looks like when someone combines competence with humility, strength with service, and authority with genuine care for others. His students didn't just learn about history, they learned about character. They didn't just study past wars, they discovered present-day principles that would guide them through future challenges. Most importantly, they learned that heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry weapons. Sometimes they wear pressed khakis and wire-rimmed glasses, carry worn briefcases, and change the world one lesson at a time. So I ask you, have you ever encountered someone like Mr. Wilson? A teacher, coach, mentor, or leader who seemed ordinary until circumstances revealed their extraordinary character and capabilities? Have you met someone who served in ways both big and small, who carried hidden strength with quiet dignity, who made you better simply by expecting you to be better? Share their story in the comments below. Tell us how they changed your perspective, what they taught you about respect and responsibility, and why their example still matters to you today. Because at the Human Stories, we believe that the most important battles are often fought in classrooms, not battlefields. And the most lasting victories are won not with weapons, but with wisdom, patience, and the unwavering belief that every young person deserves to learn from someone who truly understands what it means to serve. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that great teachers, like great warriors, are forged in challenging circumstances and revealed in moments when strength and character matter most. We'll see you in the next story, where ordinary people continue to do extraordinary things in the quiet service of others. Until then, remember, respect isn't given, it's earned. Authority isn't claimed, it's demonstrated. And the best lessons aren't taught, they're lived.